Hi, great to have you here. If it's your first time, don't forget to subscribe and send this video to someone close to you. Drop a comment with your city or country. I really appreciate hearing from you. Let's start. It was the kind of night that slipped seamlessly into the routine of everyday life, indistinguishable from 100 others. Gwen was seated at the dinner table, finishing the meal Paul had carefully prepared, when she said something that would quietly fracture the evening, and more. With the casualness of a weather report, she uttered, "Aaron, Camille, and I are thinking of traveling across Europe." Paul's hand paused mid-air, fork suspended. Gwen either didn't notice or chose not to acknowledge the shift in the room. She kept speaking, her voice light, unaffected. He forced a small, polite smile, offering a stock response while something heavy settled in his chest. Meanwhile, Gwen radiated enthusiasm. Her words tumbled out, animated by the allure of ancient cities, sunlit streets, art galleries, and a sense of liberation she hadn't felt in years. There was no second-guessing, no apology in her tone. It was as though the idea had been waiting, barely restrained. As she spoke, Paul began to see it clearly. This wasn't just about a trip. Beneath her lively description of plans and places, something more profound stirred, a quiet but unmistakable withdrawal. He knew her too well not to recognize it. The way she avoided his eyes, the deliberate steadiness in her voice masking deeper emotions. This was more than wanderlust. This was a step away from their shared life. On the surface, Paul remained composed. Internally, the ground shifted. Memories flared, of the house they had recently moved into, afternoons spent debating color palettes, arranging furniture, mapping out dreams. And now, here was Gwen, talking of independence and exploration, as if those plans were distant relics, buried beneath cardboard boxes and forgotten intentions. They didn't argue. Paul chose not to press. Instead, he listened, absorbing each word, every pause, every bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. He noticed when her gaze dropped to her wineglass, to her plate, anywhere but him. The woman who once promised to share everything with him now seemed to be rehearsing a life without him. He realized in that moment that trying to talk her out of it would be useless. Her decision had already taken root. This wasn't a question. It was a quiet declaration. She had moved ahead, emotionally if not yet physically. And so, swallowing the bitterness rising in his throat, Paul made a choice. He wouldn't plead. He gave her the best approximation of encouragement he could find and told her he supported her desire to explore. But deep within, dread coiled, an aching fear that everything he believed to be stable was quietly unraveling. And yet, beneath that fear, something resolute began to form. After Gwen went to bed, Paul stayed downstairs, the soft hum of the house the only sound as he faced the truth. What once felt solid and shared now seemed fragile, strained to the point of breaking. He opened his laptop with steady hands and began reviewing their financials, not rashly, but with cold clarity. He opened a separate account in his name. He adjusted their joint holdings to ensure a portion quietly filtered into his control. He scheduled a legal consultation, wanting to understand where he stood if things fell apart completely. Each step, each piece of paperwork, was a reclaiming of control, a defense against the slow, encroaching grief. If Gwen was preparing to walk a new path, he needed to secure his footing on his own. While she dreamed of winding streets and uncharted tomorrows, Paul began laying the foundation of his own future. He understood this moment for what it was, the prelude to a much longer unraveling. Her words that evening were the first crack, and he could feel the tremors coming. But he vowed not to grovel, not to fight for love already retreating. If she had chosen to leave, he would let her. Even if it meant surrendering every comfort he had once clung to, even if it meant learning, all over again, how to release what had once felt permanent. When the hours had slipped away and only silence remained, he shut his laptop, turned off the lights, and climbed the stairs. He paused at the bedroom door, watching her sleep. She looked peaceful, removed. He thought of their shared years, lazy Sundays, spur-of-the-moment getaways, the quiet habits of a long love. In the stillness, he whispered a goodbye she'd never hear, not to her presence, but to the version of her who had once belonged wholly to him and maybe never truly had. Without a sound, he slipped into bed beside her. The space between them felt vast, impassable. He closed his eyes, took a breath, and accepted what he had long been resisting. Something essential had changed. Their life, their marriage, it still stood, but only in form. The essence was already slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The days that followed carried a quiet weight, a fragile calm threaded with sorrow, and the anxious sense of something inevitable drawing near. Gwen packed her suitcase with the calm precision of someone stepping into something new, something promising. Paul sat nearby, quiet, watching her every movement like someone rereading a story he knew by heart, one with no surprises left. There were no last-minute confessions or clinging goodbyes, just a gentle kiss on her forehead and a soft, echoing promise to stay in touch. And just like that, like heading out for groceries, she walked out the door. The stillness that followed settled heavily in the house, almost physical in its presence. Without her, the space felt more saturated, more present than it ever had when she was there. But Paul held firm to his choice. He wouldn't reach out, wouldn't question, wouldn't try to pull her back. His silence was a shield, his own quiet attempt to avoid another heartbreak. Her social media, once a shared canvas of their life together, became a steady stream of reminders that he was no longer part of the picture. She posted often. The first was a radiant shot, Gwen grinning in front of the Eiffel Tower, a wine glass aloft, flanked by Aaron and Camille like they'd been her soulmates all along. Then came a video, Gwen strolling by the Seine, laughing with strangers, as if happiness could be gathered from foreign pavement. Paul didn't reply, didn't like or comment. He just watched. Every post felt purposeful, a declaration of independence, a new beginning. He could have spared himself the pain by looking away, but he didn't. Something in him needed to see, needed proof, needed to understand. Then, in what seemed like an ordinary photo, something caught his eye and froze him in place. Her left hand, bare. The ring was gone. That tiny omission hit him harder than any conversation ever could. That ring had been through every fight, every birthday, every lazy morning. It had survived the rhythms of routine, and now, against a backdrop of ancient cities, it was simply gone, left behind without ceremony. He zoomed in on the image repeatedly, searching for some innocent explanation. Maybe she'd taken it off just for that photo. Maybe she'd forgotten it that day. But deep down, he knew. It was no accident. It was a message, subtle but final. She had already moved on. From there, the signs kept piling up. In one photo from Rome, she stood among a crowd, smiling, a man's hand resting on her back like it belonged there. In Barcelona, she was caught mid-dance, inches from a man with long hair, their closeness unmistakably intimate. Paul saved every post, stored every photo, like gathering evidence from a story unraveling in real time. Each heart, each comment, added to the growing ache in his chest. Her friends cheered her on, praising her newfound glow, her freedom. No one spoke of the man left behind. The one still holding on to shared plans, while hers now revolved around herself. One sleepless night bled into dawn, and Paul scrolled through her newest uploads. She looked unburdened, as if she'd shed everything that had ever weighed her down. And tucked into the corner of one picture, there he was again. That man, in city after city, always close, always there. Paul couldn't say for sure who he was, a fellow tourist, a new love, maybe both. But what became undeniable was that it no longer mattered. What mattered was this. Gwen had already built a life where Paul no longer had a place. And still, he said nothing. No angry messages, no emotional pleas. He bore it all in silence, like someone who never had the chance to fight before surrendering. Then, out of nowhere, a memory pierced through the numbness. A distant afternoon, back when everything was still unfolding, when they'd sat together on a bench making promises. Gwen had turned to him and said, "If you ever lose your way, I'll come find you. And if I get lost, I hope you'll come find me." Now, Paul saw the truth. He'd been searching for her in every curated laugh, every crafted pose. But Gwen wasn't lost. She didn't want to be found. She wanted to float away. And maybe, just maybe, love isn't about chasing someone who's walking away, but about knowing when to stop chasing. Still, every new post stung, quietly, deeply, not bitter, just mournful. It was the grief that comes from something once beautiful, something that can never quite be rebuilt. As her world expanded and brightened, his shrank and grew rawer, more exposed. Without even realizing it, Paul had begun mourning a marriage that, while still intact on paper, had long since slipped from her heart. When morning came again, flooding the room with light and another round of jubilant photos, Paul simply sighed, took another screenshot, and carried on. He knew the pain wasn't done with him yet. More days like this would come. But each one brought him incrementally closer to the hardest, and maybe the truest decision he'd ever make. And when Gwen finally returned through that familiar door, her smile was effortless, weightless, almost cruel in its ease. As she pulled her suitcase across the threshold, her voice floated with the lightness of someone recounting a restful vacation. She moved with ease, her tone breezy, her steps certain, as if nothing had shifted. But to Paul, each offhand comment underscored the inevitable truth. The distance between them had grown too wide to ever close. Still, he stayed composed, the way someone does when they've already come to terms with the ending. They're just reading the last page now. Without a glance back, Gwen set her luggage by the wall and made her way to the kitchen. On the table sat a single envelope, impossible to miss. Its crisp edges and central placement made it look deliberate, like a punctuation mark at the end of something unspoken. She caught sight of it but looked away, instead launching into loosely connected tales of charming European streets, tucked-away cafes, and supposedly life-changing revelations. Paul remained where he was, listening without expression. Her words, once a source of joy, now felt weightless, echoing in a room that no longer held space for shared dreams. When her voice finally lost momentum, he didn't speak. He simply motioned toward the envelope. Her gaze followed his, pausing there with hesitation. For the first time since arriving, the certainty in her faltered. She reached for the envelope, opened it with careful fingers, and pulled out the contents. Her eyes raced across the pages, legal agreements for the transfer of property, a detailed list dividing their possessions, and confirmation of a moving service scheduled to assist her departure. The contents landed like a sudden blow. She hadn't anticipated such finality from him. She stammered, fumbling through half-formed appeals, suggesting they'd moved too fast, hinting at gentler ways to approach it, even vaguely proposing they revisit their decisions. But Paul cut through her spiraling softly, reminding her this was what she had once asked for: space, freedom, and this was his way of giving it to her. There was no malice in his voice, no resentment, only the steady self-assurance of someone who had rediscovered their own value. When she asked if this was truly the end, he nodded without pause. He explained that the paperwork was complete. The home was now his alone, a place they had once imagined a future in, now reclaimed as his alone to rebuild. She, who had sought a life apart from theirs, would now continue on that road, unencumbered by a history she had already stepped away from. Still, Gwen resisted. She brought up the early days, how they'd spent their first night in this house, the nursery they had once hoped to decorate, the afternoons they'd lain on the floor, mapping out dreams. Her words were sincere, but they arrived too late. Paul didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. It wasn't detachment that kept him quiet. It was clarity. Sentiment couldn't erase the choices that had already been made. He gently reminded her that the movers would arrive in 2 days. She had until then to choose what to take. The rest had been organized already. Whatever remained, he would donate. There would be no pleading, no last-minute drama. The bond they once had was fading, not with a dramatic ending, but with the quiet dignity of someone choosing to let go, even when it hurt. Tears began to slip down her cheeks, quiet, unguarded. She looked for something in him, any flicker that might undo what had already been set in motion. But Paul remained firm, not out of cruelty, but out of self-respect. After all the silence, the unanswered calls, the photos that told their own quiet truths, he had come to understand that love alone couldn't hold together what one person had already walked away from. As darkness settled over the house, Gwen climbed the stairs to a bedroom that had already stopped feeling like hers. Downstairs, Paul stayed seated, surrounded by the silence of a place that felt hollow, yet full of possibility. In that stillness, he understood. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is close the door that stayed open far too long for someone who was never coming back. By morning, when the moving truck pulled into the driveway, Paul watched from the window, distant and detached. The scene below felt almost abstract, as if it belonged to someone else's life. Gwen descended the stairs briskly, avoiding his gaze. She had packed in silence, offering no farewells, only a quiet urgency to leave behind a space that no longer offered solace. One by one, the movers removed the remnants of what had once been their life: furniture, boxes, echoes of moments that had once held meaning. Paul stayed where he was, watching the room empty, the dining table that had once rung with laughter, the couch where they'd drifted off during movies and whispered plans. Time moved slowly, like the final act of a story long overdue for its ending. When Gwen finally shut the front door behind her, her face was drawn with sorrow and unspoken regret. Paul gave a simple, silent nod. There were no words left, no promises were exchanged. No heartfelt farewells or hopeful talk of crossing paths again. It ended, firmly, silently, with the kind of finality that leaves the air too still. In the days that followed, the house felt more cavernous than Paul had expected. The sound of his own footsteps bounced off the walls, accentuating the emptiness. Each room seemed haunted by the fading outlines of a life that no longer felt like his. Still, Paul knew this would be the foundation from which he'd rebuild. He hadn't escaped to another city or sought distraction in distance. He stayed, not to erase the past, but to reshape it. Tangibly, this meant reimagining the space around him. The photos that once adorned the walls with care were gently removed, not out of bitterness, but to make room for what might come next. Slowly, the shared furnishings were swapped out, one item at a time. Little by little, the house began to carry only his story. He unearthed an old guitar buried in storage and began strumming again. A camera, once forgotten and dusty, was cleaned off and placed in clear view, a subtle emblem of rediscovered joy. These small, quiet choices marked the beginning of reclaiming a version of himself long put aside. He enrolled in a photography course at the neighborhood art center, something he had always intended but never pursued. He took pleasure in cooking just for himself, in aimless walks with no destination, in the slow rhythm of cafe afternoons spent observing passers-by. It was on one such idle day that he encountered Mrs. Hensley, an elderly neighbor with kind eyes who lived a few doors down. She caught him tending to the overgrown garden and strolled over, offering a handful of herb seeds she'd cultivated over decades. To someone still caught in the churn of routine life, it might have seemed insignificant, but for Paul, the gesture held quiet power. It was a sign that life continued to grow, often in places where you least expected it. In her gentle way, Mrs. Hensley shared the kind of wisdom known only to those who work closely with the earth. She talked of seeds that took their time, saying the slowest often grew the strongest, resilient, deep-rooted, unhurried. Each conversation with her felt like a lesson in disguise, a reminder that starting over isn't about sudden sparks, but about patience, care, and the courage to begin again. Around the same time, Paul began reaching out to those around him, building connections he had never sought during his marriage. He began accepting casual invitations, barbecues, game nights, impromptu street chats. Gradually, his world widened. A new, quiet network of community emerged, steady and sincere, filling a void he hadn't realized was there. As the days passed, he came to understand that the solitude he once feared wasn't a punishment. It was a canvas, waiting for new strokes of color. No longer defined by his role as a husband or the echoes of shared experiences, Paul stood as himself. Yes, he carried scars, but he no longer viewed them as wounds. They had become symbols of healing, and slowly he came to see that freedom wasn't the reckless abandonment Gwen had once praised. True freedom, he discovered, was the gentle ability to be fully yourself without yielding parts of your soul to fit someone else's mold. This was the life he was now building, intentionally, piece by piece. He made subtle but significant changes. The colors in the house shifted. His own photographs began to adorn the walls. Simple moments turned profound through his lens. Mornings arrived with calm instead of grief. Evenings were solitary, but no longer laced with despair. The weight of sorrow had given way to something softer, a quiet acceptance. And in that space, Paul started to rediscover himself, not the version shaped by compromise. Not the man who kept his dreams tucked away, who measured love by what was withheld, but someone who laughed openly at a good book, who took pride in a meal cooked just right, who paused to notice tiny blossoms on the balcony rail. The home, once the backdrop of a dream that had faded, was slowly transforming into a space that felt fully his, built on his terms, by his own hands. And though certain evenings still carried the sting of memory, Paul knew he was moving forward. He no longer needed dramatic change to find himself. What mattered was showing up, day after day, for the life he was quietly nurturing. In the planting, the creating, the choosing, every act, no matter how small, was a way of reclaiming his story. Each change a quiet testament that he was now the one writing it. Even with all that had been lost, something deeper was taking root, his truest self. Weeks had gone by since Gwen had taken her final belongings. These days, Paul's life unfolded gently, marked by simple routines, neighborly conversations, and thoughtful afternoons spent alone. The sting of parting hadn't disappeared, but it had dulled, like a bruise that fades to a shadow. He could walk through his home now without stumbling over the past. He had begun to savor the comfort of his own company, something unfamiliar, yet welcome. And then, one ordinary afternoon, seated in a cafe and laughing with an old friend over coffee, the news arrived, sudden and electric, like a strike of lightning. The news came not with delicacy, but as an afterthought, slipped into conversation by a mutual acquaintance who seemed unsure how else to say it. Gwen was pregnant. No preamble, no softened edges, just a cold, flat fact, delivered with the same casualness one might use to mention the weather. Paul froze, uncertain if he'd misheard. He forced a polite smile, lips dry, as the statement echoed, loud and unrelenting, in his mind. 1,000 questions ignited at once. When had it happened? With whom? Why now? And most cruelly, could it be his? Since their parting, Gwen had vanished without a trace. Not a single call, no late-night texts filled with hesitation. Just silence. And now, to learn something so profound through a third party felt like reopening a wound he'd worked so hard to let scar. Doubt rushed in, swift and merciless. Could the child be his? Was there still some unseen thread binding them, some irreversible tether that hadn't been severed despite the distance? The thought of a baby, possibly his, born from the ashes of what they had lost, unsettled him deeply. He tried to push it aside. Maybe the best course was to stay removed, to let Gwen live this next chapter without him turning the pages. But the thought refused to settle. The silence inside him grew too loud to ignore. He knew the only way to quiet the noise was to confront it. That night, after pacing aimlessly through his apartment, he finally reached for the number he never quite erased. Each ring pulsed through his chest like a warning. When Gwen answered, her voice was cool, detached. Paul wasted no time. He told her what he'd heard and asked for the truth. The pause that followed felt endless. Then, with the same calm finality she had used the day she left, she gave him her answer. The baby wasn't his. No emotion, no hesitation. Just words that hit like a locked door. Any fragile hope he hadn't admitted to was gone in an instant. He muttered a thank you, though it felt hollow, and ended the call. For a long time, he stood still, phone in hand, staring at nothing. What he felt wasn't rage, nor jealousy, but a sorrow so deep it didn't need a name. A sorrow not for something he had lost, but for something that was never his to lose, yet still managed to wound him. A new life was on the way, and it would arrive in the aftermath of a love that had broken instead of blossomed. He couldn't stop thinking about the child's future. Would the child grow up hearing stories clouded by time and perspective? Would they carry an emptiness they couldn't explain? Would they feel the absence of someone who was never meant to be there in the first place? The grief that settled in Paul wasn't loud. It was quiet, enduring, and all the more painful for it. Not because he'd been cast aside, but because he still felt deeply enough to be hurt by what wasn't his choice anymore. And yet, in that stillness, Paul came to see what certain truths do best. They don't fix what's broken. They simply affirm what the heart always suspected. Some endings aren't meant to be unraveled. They are meant to be accepted and left behind. Slipping the phone back into his pocket, he let the weight of that chapter fall away. Gwen's life, and the child within it, would move forward without him. What remained was his own path, still solitary perhaps, but honest. A road he would continue to walk, even if his heart hadn't yet caught up. One day, the pain would fade into memory. The wounds would close into quiet, private stories he'd keep within himself, echoes of a past he had survived, and reminders of the love he once knew. This story has come to an end. What's your opinion? Share it in the comments, my friend. And if you like this story, check out other exciting videos on my channel. I'll say goodbye until the next video. See you.